I thought it's important that I should at least sort of share why this day came about. So if you think I'm talking too long, please, tell me. Yeah. I thought, anyway, I'll try to give you a bit of an introduction. I did sort of start mentioning a few things earlier about it, and this whole concept of vocation and mission, which is so beautifully expressed by Hugh, which is actually so important in the Vatican II documents. But this conference today is sponsored by two groups, Mark on behalf of the Cardine Community of Australia, and me on behalf of the Australian Cardine Institute. So I know some of you know a bit about both of our groups, but anyway, I thought I should tell you at least a little bit about what our purpose is as the Australian Cardine Institute. And of course, the name tells the story. Cardine is what we're about, and so promoting the life and legacy of Joseph Cardine. But what I've put, if you could go to the next slide, Ashish, thanks. We, because we're from the YCW or the YCS, we think of Cardine in relation to those movements. But actually, if you look at Cardine's life, like every life, our life goes way beyond the movement that we've been involved in. So, I think it's an important part of his life, formative for him, the fact that he was a high school teacher, he was a curate in a parish, he was a democracy activist. We don't sort of think about that too much when we think of him as the founder of the YCW. He was a resistor. He resisted German occupation in the First World War and in the Second World War. He was a spy. And when I was in the archives of the Archdiocese of Brussels, I came across these documents of all these priests that were going to be executed. And I really believe he just barely escaped execution because he was involved with all the underground networks, providing information to the Allies about what the Germans were doing and where. But our life, everything would be different if he'd been one of those who was executed. Political prisoner, director of social works, what we call Catholic Social Services Australia, that's what he was. He was director of that for not the whole Archdiocese of Brussels, but for the Brussels region. And so it was in that context that he was able to sort of start making the YCW happen on a larger level than just the parish where he was. Of course, as I say, we know him as the founder of the YCW, but it's mentioned in the Margaret Fever biography of Cardine that he also founded a student movement. It was called the Catholic Social Youth. As far as I know, no one's ever written the history of that. I was in Rome 10 days ago. I found a few references in the archives to the work of the Catholic Social Youth in the 1920s. And I've seen also different references in Belgium. And if you remember that biography of Cardine, the one action that they talk about was where there was young workers being oppressed in the factory, and the students bought shares in a company and went to the general meeting of the company and protested what was happening. That was sort of one of the actions. But it went for about 10 years, and then it was kind of succeeded by the YCS, high school level, and also the university YCS. But he actually founded that, which has never really been written up as part of the thing that he did. At the Second Vatican Council, he had a number of roles. I remember when I was a young full-timer in 1979, Terry Byrne, some of you knew Terry, he was full-timer with me. We went to see the Archbishop, and he pulled out the Vatican II documents from the shelf behind him and held them up like that and said, Vatican II canonised Cardine. I was kind of, I won't say shocked, but I was sort of like surprised. I mean, I hadn't sort of a thing that had ever occurred to me. But when I actually started writing my PhD thesis, I realised he actually had 4 roles at the council, 3 official roles and the 4th unofficial role, which maybe was the most important of all. The first official role was he was in the Preparatory Commission on Lay Apostolate. And sometimes we know him as a cardinal, and we think, oh wow, this guy with great status in the church and respected and listened to. If you look at that Preparatory Commission, he wrote, in 18 months, he wrote 17 papers. It was a battle to get his ideas, that is the ideas of the YCW, across. Because even if it was the Lay Apostolate Commission, most of the people didn't really understand what he was on about. So it was a huge battle in that commission. Then the actual council started in October 1962, And most people that are in the preparatory commission, they continued as advisors in the council. But he didn't. Why? Because his archbishop, the famous Cardinal Cernunz, didn't want him there. Cernunz, as a bishop in Brussels, opposed him and undermined him for at least 10 years before the council and tried to stop him from becoming, they call them peritus, an expert in the council. And it was a Brazilian bishop. There was several of them actually, but the one that's famous in Australia is Helder Camara. Helder Camara sort of started a low-key, very polite campaign. I mean, when you're bishops, you don't go out protesting. You make polite little representations. And he wrote a letter to Cernunz saying, it's Cardine's 80th birthday. It'd be great if you could do something for him. But the one unstated was, meaning, don't stop Cardine from being a peritus in the council. But the people that supported Cardine in that were the bishops of Latin America and the bishops of France, because that's where the movement was strong. So that was his second role. So how did he become a cardinal? Again, it was Helder Camara. Before John the 23rd died, Helder Camara went to him. He was dying of cancer and said, John, you've got to make Cardine a cardinal and an archbishop. Why? Because that had put him on equal status with his boss, Cardinal Cernunz. Unfortunately, John the 23rd died. Paul VI is elected. 6 weeks after Paul VI is elected, Helder Camara writes a letter to Paul VI. You've got to make Cardine a cardinal and an archbishop. And that is how Cardine became a cardinal and archbishop in February 1965. It was to get him out from underneath Cernunz and to give him the freedom to speak freely in the Second Vatican Council. And so that's how he had the three roles in the actual council itself. But actually, and he did have a huge influence in the things that he did. How did C. Gigacz get into Gaudium and Spes? Well, because he'd been lobbying for it for so long. But who helped him? At Vatican II, there were 250 bishops who had been mainly YCW and YCS chaplains before they became bishops. Now you think, out of roughly 2,500 bishops, you've got 250 YCW and YCS bishops. And when they were YCW and YCS chaplains, what did they do? They taught young workers and young students how to influence their peers. So they're bishops now, they're in the council. They do what they taught those young workers and students to do. And I found a letter from a Canadian bishop showing how he wrote down the list of his contacts in the council, just like Mark mentioned the leader's notebook, He wrote down the list of the bishops in the council he was in contact with. And so that is how those 250 bishops inside Vatican II came to have an outsized impact on the whole council itself. Because, like I say, Cardinal Cernunz opposed Cardine. Cernunz didn't want the C-Judge Act to be the basis of what became Gaudium and Spes. He tried to get it go off in another direction. This is what the church says, blah, blah, blah. This is what people do. The French bishops again and the Latin American bishops, they marginalised, they took over the process and they passed a motion saying that this document, which became known as Gaudium and Spes, will be drafted using the C-Judge Act method. And that is how Gaudium and Spes to today, if you read it, you will see it's structured around the C-Judge Act method. Then there's the decree on the apostolate of the laity, number 29. C-Judge Act as the method of formation for lay people. So I think this is important. When I was 18 and 19 in the YCW, this is not important to me. If Michael Campbell had started talking to me about this sort of stuff, I wouldn't have come the next week. But we're not 18 and 19-year-old YCW members kind of interested in the girl that's sitting across from the table. We're people, some of us are studying theology, some of us have got vicar generals, some of us got teaching roles, quite important in wherever we're going. So I think this sort of thing is things that we've got to know, because, and I'll tell you this, I try not to tell too many stories, but how did I come to write my PhD thesis? My PhD thesis was on the role of Cardine at the Second Vatican Council. Because like I mentioned, our Archbishop in Melbourne said Vatican II canonised Cardine. In 1995, there's a big, huge, about 2,500, probably 3,000 or 4,000 pages altogether, the 5 volumes. There's a 5-volume history of the Second Vatican Council. And I was living in Belgium and I bought the first volume, $150 Australian dollars, something. Not a mention of cardine in the first volume. 2 years later, the second volume comes out. Still no mention of cardine. Couldn't believe it, you know. Finally, the third volume comes out. He gets a footnote. The aging Cardinal Cardine gave a little speech about religious freedom in the final session. There's a chapter on lay apostolate there. Nothing about cardine. They did mention Patrick Keegan from the UK. In the whole 5 volumes of the history of Vatican II, a few footnotes about cardine, absolutely marginal figure, which totally contradicted, what Archbishop Frank Little had told me and what I'd read in the biography of Cardine and everything. And, this is how I sort of, going through the archives, sort of start to work out what exactly was his role at Vatican II. I went to the University of Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium, Catholic University, and I went to see the archives of Vatican II. And the church historian from Louvain-la-Neuve, this is in Belgium, Cardine's home country, everybody who wants to work in the archives, he interviewed us. He interviewed you personally. What do you want to do? What are you going to do? So I have to talk to this guy. And his question to me was, why do you want to, some guy from Australia, why do you want to study Cardine at Vatican II? This was the leading expert on church history in Belgium. He never knew that Cardine gave 5 interventions in the Second Vatican Council. He even wrote at least one chapter in that 5-volume history, but he didn't know. Because people perceived Cardine as, sort of this guy that gave great public speeches and a sort of kind of a demagogue and worked with youth, and especially working youth. I mean, it's like the carpenter from Nazareth, what good will come out of Nazareth? And that's sort of the attitude of the kind of, you could say, the elite academic Catholic world, even up to today. And I think that's why I kind of do what I do, and I try to sort of, encourage a few of us. We create this thing called the Australian Cardine Institute to promote that legacy of Cardine at an academic level, and we try to keep it alive. And in Australia, you'll know also, Jim was there, he'll talk about that later, the Australian Plenary Council, the direction of the church. Well, one of the things that we did as the Australian Cardine Institute, we put in a couple of submissions, and we did actually get a little sort of line in it to the effect that there ought to be formation for the lay apostolate. But, maybe Jim can say something about that later. But we basically did that by the back door. Thanks to the new Archbishop of Brisbane, he basically helped us get a couple of lines into there. I felt, and I still feel, the idea of Cardine and everything has pretty much been marginalised in the church. We tried again for the Synod on Synodality last year in Rome, big, huge thing from around the world. I don't even know how many people. Do you know at Vatican II, there were around about 50 lay people who were there as auditors. Most of them came from lay movements, including Patrick Keegan and another guy, Bartolo Perez from the YCW and other movements. At the Synod on Synodality, which is supposed to be about involving everybody, only 3 movements were represented. Only 3. Not, there's stacks more movements since Vatican II, so why weren't there more? There was less. And if you look at the 3 movements, I'm not criticising anybody from Italy, but all the movements were kind of Italian origin, Focolari. No criticism, it's a great movement. But it's like the Vatican, it hasn't got more international at that level, it's got less international. It's like the people in the dicastery for the laity don't really know what's going on in the world. We better get at least a couple of lay movements here. Who can we get? Well, Focolari we know. There's an Italian NGO which rescues people from the Mediterranean. We'll get them. And I forgot who the third one was. And that's all that were there. It's unbelievable, really. And some of you know Pat Branson from church. They're setting up a new diocesan pastoral council. One of the things for the diocesan pastoral council is, and the person who was facilitating the meeting for the potential candidates specifically told the people there, I might be paraphrasing the words because I wasn't there exactly, but Pat Branson reported this. They don't want people representing movements there on the Diocesan Pastoral Council. They said it explicitly. This is the new Diocesan Pastoral Council for Perth. This is the orientation of the church that it's going into. Sure, everybody says there's lots of lay people involved in the church, but most of them are working for the institutional church. Where are the movements like the YCW, the YCS, Christian Worker Movement, whatever other movements there might be? Literally, we're on the outer. And that's the fact of the church. And I've got to stop, but I want to show you one thing. I was shocked when I found this. Could you go to this thing of Caroline's deathbed message? I don't know if you can read it on the screen. But when I was starting my PhD thesis, I went to see this French guy, Joseph Weber. He'd been international treasurer in 1965-69. He was there when Caroline died with Rienzi Rupasinga. Some of you might know Rienzi from Canberra, still lives in Canberra now, but from Sri Lanka. And Caroline is going to die in about 3 or 4 days. So he gives them a message. And this is what the message is, After the debates of Vatican II, the change is decided. Powerful conservative forces at the Vatican will start to mobilise. The YCW contributed a great deal to the council, like I just said, but all the bishops, the cardinals, the elders and others have taken into account that vision. He gives credit to others, not to himself. But very powerful forces will try to break it and block its recognition inside the renewed church. And the YCW will be subject to harsh tests of resistance on the part of, it's a prediction of what exactly happened. In my experience, I saw things happen to the international YCW during the 1980s and 70s. This week, it might even be today, is the 50th anniversary of the death of Pepe Palacio, a young lay, well, actually at that time he wasn't young, but he was a lay leader from the Argentinian YCW. He was dropped, we don't know for sure exactly what happened, but he was one of those, what they call disappeared in Argentina. After the YCW, he joined the Christian worker movement, which Michael and Helen and others used to belong to. He was picked up literally from outside the office and disappeared. For 25 years, his mum, who had three or four boys at that time, they knew he was dead, but they never knew what happened. One of the sons grew up, and finally the government changed and they got into the archives, and it was confirmed. He was killed under this program called in Vietnam was called Phoenix. In Latin America, it was called Project Condor. It was a project sponsored by the CIA and the American government to get rid of community leaders, grassroots leaders, and trade union leaders, and people doing organising work. And so many of them, they were picked up and they were dropped from helicopters into the sea. And that's probably what happened to Pepe Palacio. But what's significant about that story is he was the first international lay collaborator for the international YCW. He was elected in April 1975. He was killed in December 1975 before he took up his position. So, it's a really important story for us, all those things that happened. And it sort of confirms what was, all the problems Cardine saw. It's not that he was could see sort of the future. What he could see was what happened to him, all the struggles he had. And maybe we're not suffering physically, but I do feel, I don't know what you feel, but I see the YCW around the world, it's kind of marginalised from a lot of the things that the church is doing. And that's, for me, one of my personal motivations of why I thought it's important that we try and have this day. Ashish is doing great work. Talia's doing great work with Cardine College. I think we've got to find a way to support people. And we're former YCW, YCS people. How are we supporting? What can we do? So that's what I wanted today to be about. I want to stop talking now because I think it's really important that you all have the chance to talk.